Good morning. Let me lift this up a little bit. Can you hear me? Okay. Good morning, bienvenidos, y gracias por invitarme. My name is Juliette Gutierrez Fernandez, and I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I manage 4 national wildlife refuges here in Southwest Washington, and these are lands specifically designated for wildlife and you. Has anyone been to a wildlife refuge? Sorry, show of hands. A couple of you, okay. So my job is to restore, enhance, and protect fish and wildlife and their habitats for the continuing benefit of people. With climate change, my job is getting harder and I need your help. As the climate changes, weather is becoming more extreme, people are losing homes to flooding, wildfires are increasing, and smoke is settling in our neighborhoods. Our rivers are running out of water, and so are people. Extreme heat waves are more common. Chemicals from factories spill into our tap water, and blue skies are turning to gray in our most vulnerable communities. Nature has always helped us, even when we didn't know she was hard at work. Native plants give us oxygen, clean our water, prevent flooding, but concrete is replacing our forests. Over 1 million species of animals are threatened with becoming endangered. Pollinators like bees bring us fruit and vegetables, but since 2007, some bee species have fallen by over 80%. Today, your mascot is the Sasquatch, who came in and said hi earlier. I care for a lot of mammals, but I admit I have not seen a Sasquatch in the wild. We know Sasquatch to be elusive. Often people know about the lore of it, but not much more. Maybe a couple of people consider themselves experts. But Sasquatch is not exactly walking through our neighborhoods and knocking on our doors, right? Not long ago, climate change was a similar lore. People had heard the words here or there. Maybe a few considered themselves experts. It felt elusive, but that's changed. Climate change is knocking at our doors, and it is walking through our neighborhoods. So how are we going to answer? I believe that every human has the right to clean water, a home free of wildfire, temperatures cool enough to live. Often, people impacted the most by climate change are people without the financial resources to protect themselves. I believe that all people have equal rights to healthy lands and happy homes. The people to your left and right deserve clean air. Regardless of our income, skin color, race, or where you're from, we all breathe together. We should all have equal access to healthy, sustainable, and resilient environments in which we play, live, work, learn, grow, worship, and engage. That is environmental justice. This is where you come in. I know it all feels really heavy, and we might not know where to start, but when I look at you, I see where we can start. Together, we can uplift our communities, be more resilient and sustainable. Together, we can connect to change the earth, one little Bigfoot at a time. I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but today I'm speaking to you personally. I'm going to share with you a little bit about me and what drove me to this career, and how I'm using it to change my piece of the earth with you. So I grew up on the international border between Mexico and Arizona in a little town called Nogales. Has anybody been there? Oh, one.
That's why I go to the dentist.
All right, lots of dentists there. So where I'm from, people spoke Spanish more than English. Ranchero music played in our grocery stores. Parking lots would sometimes cave in underground from the underground tunnels that connected Mexico and the United States. The city signs for fire trucks would say bombero instead of fire truck. And I thought this was pretty standard in America. This is where I was from. My dad's first language was Spanish. But when he started school, if he spoke Spanish, the teacher would hit him with a ruler, so he quickly learned English. When my sister and I were growing up, we spoke English with a mix of Spanish words, usually cuss words if we dropped something or to make a story funnier. But it was embedded in every conversation. Where I grew up, at any high point in the city, you could see the border fence that separated the two countries, and a river that flowed from Mexico into the United States. Often it was dry or in a crazy flash flood. The border fence changed over the years. When I was little, it was a small chain link fence, and now it's commonly referred to as the border wall. And my grandma and my great aunt lived in small adobe pink and purple houses right at the base of the fence. My great aunt was my first introduction to nature. We'd walk around and fill the bird feeders, water the plants, and look at bugs. I remember black clouds from Mexico would float overhead, and we'd pick leaves for tea. We'd take breaks, have a couple of glasses of tap water, and then we'd go walk again. When I would spend the night, we would say our Spanish prayers and go to sleep. Sometimes we could hear gunshots out in the distance. On celebrations, on holidays, sometimes you could hear a lot of gunshots ringing out in celebration. For us, tamales and beans at Christmas were normal. Family gatherings were about 30 people in each room, and kids would bring food to our aunts and uncles. I remember my elders challenging each other to card games, and they'd be shouting, "Tontito," or "You're cheating," from the other room. And then they'd bust out laughing. They taught me and my cousins those card games that they learned when they were kids. In our town, there really wasn't much to do. There was a Denny's and a bowling alley, or we'd hang out at each other's houses. That was my high school. Until I turned 18, and the legal drinking age in Mexico is 18, and let's not talk about that. But my prom, a nightclub in Mexico. Everybody was there, the preppies, the jocks, the nerds, it didn't matter. That's just where you go, everyone was there. It was fun and beautiful and familiar, and that was just life. I remember my sister telling me that our community's water was poison. She said that there were high rates of lupus and rare types of cancer that were found in the people that lived near this arroyo that was behind my uncle's house. Honestly, at the time, it didn't register to me. I thought, how strange. My town? I just kind of put it in the back of my head. For a handful of kids at my high school, we found peace in nature. And I had a high school teacher that offered environmental science instead of chemistry, so I was like, yeah, sign me up. We learned about overpopulation and climate change and healthy rivers and endangered species and more. Not everybody was interested. Some kids slept, but I was actually kind of curious. The teacher took us to plant trees on the weekends, and every summer a group of us would travel to the mountains and restore habitat for a fish called the Apache trout that was threatened with becoming endangered. Honestly, in high school, where I come from, none of us assumed that college was in our cards. But I was hooked, and a job in the environment was where I wanted to be. So I started applying for scholarships, anything that I could find. And I was able to go to a college that was just an hour away from my home. I worked while I wasn't in class. I got used school books, and I ate a lot of ramen, but I made it. And then one day when I was in college, a biologist from a wildlife refuge called Buenos Aires National Wildlife came and talked to us. And they shared what they did for a living. And it turned out this wildlife refuge was just a half an hour from Nogales, where I grew up, and I didn't even know that it was there. I asked if I could volunteer, and for a few months one summer, I took care of these tiny endangered baby quail in the day, and then at night I did frog surveys in these big mud puddles all night, and then I'd start over and do it again, and I loved it. It turned out there was a wildlife science degree at my college, and so that's what I did. I found work that could also give me college credits, and I did environmental education so I could start building my resume even when I was in college. I applied for this program called the Student Career Experience Program while I was in college. So you would get paid to work 640 hours on a national wildlife refuge and learn all about the science and the wildlife and everything that they did there. So I did that on my breaks and vacations from school. I got to work in 4 different states and learned a lot before I even graduated. It's interesting. When I went to college, I was around blonde people for the first time, and it was really strange. If I said where I was from, the students would tell me about times when they'd be driving through my town on their way to vacation beaches in Mexico, and they would say that their parents would say, "Lock the doors when I get out to fill the gas so that nobody can come in." I'm like, really? That's really weird. My town? My fun, familiar, beautiful town? That's so strange. Fast forward, when I was 23, I was hired with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I was a biologist at a national wildlife refuge. It was my dream. I had worked so hard. I got to be outside all day, study animals, and help them thrive. Several years later, I actually got a job at Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge, the one that was only a half an hour from my home that I didn't even know it existed. I worked really hard. I learned everything from anyone that would teach me anything. And I started getting promoted higher and higher in the agency. But what did I do? I went back to my community. I went to the classrooms of my elementary school and I attended that I had attended as a kid. And I told the students that they could do this too. My job was possible. I changed the refuge's Bluegrass Festival to mariachis and indigenous Mexican dancers because we were on the border and no one listened to bluegrass. I brought the kids from Nogales out to walk on the refuge trails with me, breathe the fresh air, walk in the shade that was cooling the path. And for many, it was the first time that far away from home. As my great aunt passed and my grandma and my extended family kind of spread out in Arizona, I got married and I was ready for the next step. Again, I got promoted in the agency and I moved to New Mexico, which wasn't that different from home. And suddenly I was supervising 17 national wildlife refuges across Arizona and New Mexico. But my job, I felt, was to change the culture and to invest in the communities we hadn't seen in our nature trails. I also began mentoring other cultural minorities that worked for this agency so that they could find their path also. One refuge that I supervised, called Valle de Oro National Wildlife Refuge, introduced me to the words environmental justice. Chemicals from nearby factories were spilling into the roads, and then when it would rain, they'd wash down into the river and into the tap water of the community. The refuge was digging these ditches through the middle of the land so that when it would rain, the plants that they put in there would drink up the chemicals, and when the rain returned out to the river, it was a cleaner version. The concept surprised me, and it really hit me, but I didn't really fully grasp why, and I kind of put it in the back of my head. Years later, my son was born, and we moved to the Pacific Northwest, where we are today. I wanted some rain, and you guys have really good schools, and I wanted that for my son. When we drove into Washington State for the first time, the highway that runs parallel to the Columbia River was just amazing. It was so big compared to the rivers in the desert where I'm from that were either dry or flooding. Waterfalls shoot out of the mountainsides, and about every fourth car had a kayak on top of it. I saw dogs wearing booties to protect their feet when they walked. Lawns were mowed, and there were whole families riding on the sidewalks on their bicycles. And I think that's when I had a revelation. There weren't any tire fires in the sky as we picked tea leaves. And for the first time, my last name was pronounced Fernandez. Fernandez with a hard A. As the new manager of 4 national wildlife refuges here in Southwest Washington, it was the first time I hadn't lived in a dominantly Hispanic community. How strange, I thought, this new town. One of the first things that I did, I reached out to Latino leadership, Northwest, to say, here's where I come from and why reaching out is important to me. I'm here for whatever you need. I became friends with your beautiful leadership, Diana, wherever she is, and all of that team. And for the last 3 years, I've been one of the speakers here to share my path, my job, and how I do it. This year, I'm so honored to be here speaking with you. But I didn't stop there. I reached out to dementia organizations, and I said, my loved ones have had dementia, and here's why it's important to me. I'm here for whatever you need. Now, we became friends, and we do guided walks on the refuge in nature to rekindle what people had lost over time. I reached out to our tribal partners. Tana is my friend. And I said, I would love just to hear from you and how I can be of service. We became friends, and our tribal partners harvest food on the refuge, give blessings to the plants and animals for the projects that we work on, and we're working together to restore some of their ancestors back onto the land. I learned we had a large Afghan and Syrian refugee community here in Clark County. I learned they love nature, but when the war came to their doorsteps, they no longer went outside. We had an event with nature walks and activities for the kids, and I learned that the women that had never driven before, if their husbands were working, wouldn't be able to get outside and go to a park even if they wanted to. So for the last year, I've taught 10 women how to drive. So now they can go to the grocery store, they can go to their children's schools, or they can go to a park if that's what they choose to do. In the last couple of years, there's been a lot of dialogue referencing underserved disadvantaged, or historically excluded, or environmental justice communities. How strange, I thought. Are there categories of people? I've always just befriended other living beings as organically as breathing or walking because my heart aches if I don't. One night, my sister texted me and told me that a high school friend of mine had died in a police shooting. When I knew him, he was gentle and kind and was known for his beautiful mariachi voice, bringing joy to anybody that would listen. I couldn't believe it, how strange, I thought, my friend. To the world outside my town, was my community underserved, disadvantaged, and historically excluded? Were we the topic of the environmental justice movement? All I ever saw was my familiar, fun, beautiful town. Someone shared with me an app that highlights environmental justice impacts on communities, and I typed the name of my little town in there. It said, 99th percentile across the United States where no one over the age of 14 speaks English. 94th percentile had income less than or equal to twice the poverty level. 97th percentile projected risk from wildfire in 30 years. 68% are high school graduates. 47% have full-time employment. 36,000 is the median household income where I'm from. I remembered my sister's comment about our water being poisoned, and I began to read all that I could. On both sides of the international border, health impacts were getting worse. Air contamination from garbage fires were causing upper respiratory tract infections, severe asthma, and premature death in elderly and people with heart conditions and lung. There were high vehicle emissions from extended idling at the border, often for hours. I read that the river that runs between the two countries were filled with chemicals from the maquiladoras, and the high rate of lupus in my town was up to 7 times higher than the prevalence in the U.S. population. I read that our tap water had statistically significant levels of arsenic and E. coli. I learned that the cost to treat lupus can be out of reach for people without the income to afford it. I read that studies were trying to understand the cause of the unusual lupus rates, but were yet unsolved. The community felt at a loss for how to change without the resources to make it themselves. Again, I thought, to the world outside my town, are we underserved, disadvantaged, and historically excluded? Have we been defined, categorized, and shelved? Maybe to the outside world, but I've decided that we're not defined by those things. We are not an environmental justice community. We are a community of beautiful people facing environmental justice concerns. We are ranchera music in a grocery store, the smell of rice in our grandma's house, hallways of family pictures, state cheese and crystallized honey and the flutter of playing cards. We are smooth skin of the Apache trout, mariachis, and roaring laughs. We are people first, vibrant and humble, and we can make a change. We can have a voice. When I think back to Valle de Oro National Wildlife Refuge cleaning the water by planting native plants and how it didn't quite register to me why it pulled that heartstring, I see it clearly now. I see the faces of my hometown in each drop from the tap, in the runoff, in the rivers, in the drought, and in the rain. I see that I can play a role and that I'm not alone. I am part of a community of earth, of living beings, of people, of the United States, of the Pacific Northwest, of Washington, of Clark County, of Latinos, of people who care about the environment or people that are just learning about it. I'm part of a community of people who care about others, who care about wildlife and plants, for children and elders, for the prominent and the voiceless. I am part of a community that believes that regardless of income, skin color, race, or where you're from, we all breathe together. We should all have equal access to healthy, sustainable, and resilient environments in which we live, play, work, learn, grow, worship, and engage. We are not strangers, you and I. We are family. We are a community. We can make a change. Through shade trees, through driving lessons, pollinator gardens, and deep-rooted plants. Maybe one small pollinator garden won't make a big change, but 500 small pollinator gardens? We can find scholarships. We can finish school. We can keep learning. We can educate ourselves and join hands and make a difference. We can call up our neighbors and say, I am here for whatever you need, and make the changes that matter to them. We can start with being people first, celebrating all of our cultures. This is where I come from, and this is why environmental justice is important to me. And if it's important to you, together we can change our piece of the world, one little big foot at a time. Thank you.